In this lesson, we're going to be looking at the position property for CSS. And what the position property does is it specifies the type of positioning method used for the element. There's four main types of values. There's static, relative, absolute, fixed, and then also there's sticky as well. So this is also commonly used for navigation bars, and this nests the element at the top of the page. So essentially it sticks, and depending on where the scroll position is, it could change from being a relative position to being a fixed position. They have some examples at the Mozilla Developer Network. So they've got a position of static, and what static does is static positions the element and it's not affected by the top, bottom, left, or right properties. And this is the default for elements without position. So it's positioning the element within a static position on the page. There's relative position, and what relative does is it positions the element relative to its normal position. So you can set the top, right, bottom, left properties as they do in the example here, and then also indicated with the yellow block that is moved over and positioned accordingly to where the top and left positions are. There's also absolute position. An absolute position is an element that is relative to the position of its ancestor. And if there are no ancestors to that element, then it's positioned relative to the body document position. So entire document position. And this is an example of where this gets positioned. And this also takes in the properties of top, left, right, or bottom. And that is how where the position of the element is determined. It sets the position on the page accordingly. And there's also fixed position, which is relative to the viewport. So that means that it stays in the same place even if the page is scrolled. And we're going to be looking at an example of that one. And then lastly, there's sticky position. And sticky position, it moves depending on where the scroll position is. So as we scroll down, it has a sticky position that acts like fixed. It also acts as relative position. And we can see that in the example on the right-hand side. There's more information, of course, about how it's computed and the different properties that can be applied to the positions. And that's all at the Mozilla Developer Network. And there's more in-depth explanations of these positions and how they work. Also some examples, as well as examples for absolute positioning, and then fixed positioning, and also sticky positioning. When you use the scroll and you scroll down, it keeps the DT element at the top of the main parent element. So now let's get into doing some coding and trying out the fixed positions. So I'm using the HTML document that we used in the last lesson. I've given the sections classes so that we can identify them and set various positions and style properties to them. So let's select the element with a class of test1, and we're going to update the position. Before we do, let's set a background color to it. Do a quick refresh. So that's identifying that this is going to be the element. This is the section with test1. Now let's set a position value for it. And the first position value that we're going to do is static position. And this is also the default position. So if we add static, we're not going to see any changes within the content. I'm also going to make the sections larger so we do have a scroll area for the content of the section. I'm going to select the section elements, and I'll set a minimum height of 400 pixels, as well as I'll add in a border so that they are distinct on the page, and we do have the scroll where we can scroll down and we can get a better sense for what position we'll do. So static position is the default. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to remove the static position and set this to relative position. And for relative position, you can add in a left, right, top, or bottom property. So let's see what left does. And I'll set it to left 50 pixels. So it's going to move it left from the side of the parent element, and it's going to move that left over. So creating a gap on the left-hand side. And then as well as top, we'll set it to top 50 pixels. So now we refresh, and where it would have normally been positioned, now it's moved over 50 and 50 down. So that's how the relative position works. So it's relative to where the normal position would have been. And I'll duplicate this and create one for test 2. And this is going to be the next section we have on the page. And this one we'll set for fixed position. So this is going to be the blue background section. So we've set a fixed position for it. And notice whenever I scroll, it's going to stay in the same fixed position. And this is relative to where the viewport is. So that means it stays in the same place even if the page is scrolled. And also notice what happened is that we don't have a width for the element. And this is also 50 pixels off the 0, 0 corner in the top left-hand side. So let's also set up a width for that. And when you do use the fixed position, then you should specify the element size. So that's the height and width. I'll set the width value to 500 pixels. So next, we're going to look at the absolute position. And we'll just copy this and use the class test3 and set this to green background. And we'll set an absolute position for it. So setting the position to be absolute. And now let's check it out within our demo and refresh. So now it's got an absolute position on the page. And we actually lost our scroll. So let me make this bigger so we do have a scroll. The absolute will still stay in the same spot. So the absolute position is relative to where the page is. So even when we're scrolling, it's always going to stay within the 0, 0 position. So relative to where the parent is and the page is. So that's starting out at the 0, 0 and it's moving in 50 and then 50 from the top. Whereas the blue, initially it's starting out on the same 50. And the blue is fixed, so it's going to stay in that same spot even when we scroll, and the green is absolute, so that moves up whenever we scroll the page up. It's going to move down, and it's going to stay on the page even if we've scrolled down, covering up that same area on the screen, on the page. You could say absolute stays absolutely at 50, 50, and fixed is fixed on the page even if it's scrolling. And the fixed always stays in the same spot, so it's always sitting within 50, 50 in relation to the page. Then we'll do one last one for sticky position. Selecting test 4. So we're going to use RGBA, and that will make the background opaque so that we can see through to the other elements behind them. And I'll update these as well to be RGBA. So now we can see, and I've increased the opacity so we can see the position of the elements on the page. And instead of absolute, I'm going to change this one to sticky. And I'm also going to move them over slightly. So start out at 50 and set this to 150. This can be 250, and then this can be 350. So let's do a quick refresh of the page content. And notice how the last one, the sticky, behaves. So once it gets into position, and unfortunately I don't have any more scroll down, so let me actually update the footer. And I'm going to set a height of the footer, make it really big, so we have lots of space to scroll down. And as you scroll, that's where you can see the real difference between the position properties and position values. And one of the best ways to get comfortable with position is to use them all on the same page, and that way you can see the different behaviors of those elements and how applying the different position values affects the element behavior as you scroll the page. Create 4 different distinct elements on the page, select them, and apply the different positioning values to those elements. Make sure that you are able to scroll the page, and then resize the page. Also make sure that you do have enough so that you get a good sense for the different position behaviors.